Thank you very much for the welcome, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this extremely stimulating conference. When I began planning how I could best set out for you my thoughts on university rankings and data and all that those words entail as Chief Executive of Australia's Group of 8 universities, I had intended to start by saying, well, welcome to my world. But given your snap general election just a few days ago, I can only start the speech by saying thank you for inviting me instead to join in your world. Because if there's anything in the world for those of us who lead groups of research-intensive universities that even more than rankings and data can fascinate, enthuse, befuddle, confuse us, irritate us, confound us, it just has to be politics, and particularly so with the last election and the outcome, whatever that may be, here in the UK. And when you think about it, that shouldn't really be so surprising. Both politics and data intrinsically affect our future. Both carry an enormous responsibility for their actions. Both judge us. Both invade and interrupt our worlds, demanding attention and responses when we're busy getting on with business and life. Both can create unintended consequences, and in our case, in Australia, we've seen just how severe those consequences can be in our recent federal budget, and I'll talk about that a bit later. So these past few days in London, I'm in the very fortunate position of being able to indulge my personal and work-life consuming interests, politics, data and rankings. So what is my world that has data and rankings play such a huge, and can I be frank and say at times overbearing part in it? First, some context, and let me draw a very quick picture of it for you. Australia has a very strong education system. We have 6 institutions listed in the top 100 of the 3 major rankings, QS of course, the Times Higher Ed and the academic ranking of world universities, the Shanghai Jiaotong. So that's not bad in a system of only 39 public universities. We are a major success story in international student education, continuing to increase our numbers year on year. And our government is so confident in our universities that it's continued to support our uncapped system, subsidising every domestic bachelor student who we agree to enrol. And of course, we are Australia's leading universities on any measure. There is no doubt that Australia does punch above its weight in the rankings. Only the US and the UK have more universities in the top 100 of the QS and the Shanghai Jiaotong than Australia. And we are a country of only 24 million people. So that's Paris, London and Barcelona combined. 3 cities, we're one country. We do have a very strong international student sector. Recent figures show that international education exports are worth $22 billion Australian to the nation. That's our 3rd largest export sector, and that sits behind iron ore and coal. Domestic higher education has boomed under the so-called demand-driven system. Domestic commencing bachelor student enrolments increased by 43% across the sector between 2008 and 2015, and up to as much as 232% at some individual non-Group of 8 institutions, all subsidised by our federal government. And yes, the Group of 8 does stand out amongst this strong system. The screen here and around the room provides a scroll through of what the Group of 8 achieves and delivers for Australia and globally. So it's no coincidence that the 6 top 100 institutions I mentioned earlier are all Group of 8 universities. This is what the data tells us. The data is correct for the given parameters in which they operate. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the picture they provide of the overall situation is reflective of the on-the-ground reality. And this is my point. There is data, and then there is interpretation of that data, and then there is understanding. Every research scientist knows that data alone can only get you so far. A direct correlation between the number of shark attacks and ice cream sales may, on the face of it, suggests that the best way to avoid being eaten by a great white shark is to eliminate frozen dairy products from your diet. But we all know that it would more likely reflect the common variable of summer. Warmer weather means more ice cream consumption at the same time as more people are entering the water and dangling themselves in front of our infamous passing predators. That's a frivolous example perhaps, but this is why it's so important that data is understood as only part, albeit an important part, of the overall picture. Context, interpretation, understanding is everything. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. The strong ranking performance for Australia demonstrates the coherence of the big picture messaging across different ranking systems. In each of these three systems that I've mentioned, the same Australian universities feature in the top spaces, though the order may rearrange themselves from year to year or from ranking to ranking. Those of us who have experience of the modern university in all its large, complex, multidisciplinary glory know that it's this picture that is probably most reflective of the strength of the entire system. But the fine-grained details of rankings performance also matter. And I'll explain how, but first just let's explore the Australian higher education sector in a little bit more detail. It probably isn't something that is front of mind for many, but it's worth adding a little bit of history here to point out with some pride that it was Australian universities, and specifically the Group of 8 because of our age, who were at the global forefront of higher education, carving out a successful international student market at scale. From the end of the Pacific War in 1945, the new nations of Asia became increasingly aware of the geographical proximity of Australia and the quality of the universities that were around at that time. By 1957, there were 4,636 Asian students in Australia. That was around 10% of the total cohort at that time. And the majority of them came from Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Indonesia. Fast forward to 1986, when the Australian government opened its doors to international students and allowed universities to accept full fee-paying foreigners. What followed was a massive recruitment and marketing drive that led to a 2,000% growth in international students between 1986 and 2006. As an example of that growth, international education, as I mentioned, is now a $22 billion a year industry for Australia, and the Group of 8 is home to 1 in 3 onshore international students who choose to study in our country. Today, 57% of the Group of 8's international student cohort is from China, and we educate nearly 60% of all Chinese students who choose to study onshore in Australia. Engagement between Australia and China in higher education actually has a relatively short history, taking shape from the last 20th century. However, in the last 40 years, that engagement has expanded rapidly and diversified. And what drives this industry for Australia? Research quality. In the most recent Excellence in Research exercise, Excellence in Research Australia or ERA, the equivalent, which is the equivalent of your REF, 99% of the research produced by the 8 Group of 8 universities was rated as world-class or above. And remember I said before that it's no coincidence that the Geo8 are the top-ranked institutions in Australia in the major ranking systems. Research performance is at the core of international rankings, and rankings drive international student numbers. But this is at risk. There is limited funding for research in Australia. Despite legislation that obliges all Australian universities to conduct both teaching and research, which is unusual by world standards, funding support for the latter is limited. International students, however, bring tuition fees. Tuition fees allow institutions to cross-subsidise from teaching and learning activities into research. So it's very fortunate that Australia does so well in education exports, because the fact is that international student numbers are sustaining our sector financially. And it's a fact that our government doesn't like to acknowledge, and us in the sector don't like to acknowledge it. So as you can see from this scene setting, a number of factors were clearly converging for the Group of 8 that would grow the power and range of that almighty and hungry data god we now know so well as university rankings. But where does this link between international research and international students come from? In June 2003, the first version of the academic, I call them the Shanghai Jiaotong rankings, was released. It was initially designed to evaluate the global standing of Chinese universities, but, as we all know in this room, that has evolved into so much more. The first version of QS followed shortly thereafter in 2004, and how universities were ranked was to forever change how we were judged internationally. Asia had and still has, despite China's emergence as a growing higher education force in its own right, a voracious market for overseas education. This market, in fact all international markets, demand high quality returns from the education investment that they make. That demand spawned the burgeoning world of on-the-ground agents. They emerged to direct student destinations and to assist process applications, and they wield rankings as one of their main marketing tools. And families in Asia began to comprehend very quickly that while they may not understand the intricacies of a distant nation, nor its universities, they could most definitely understand the meaning of the word prestige and how to use the data of rankings to make an informed choice of the targeted destination for that family member. As rankings and other specific data-heavy surveys which also populate the genre have diversified so much in recent years and have now drilled into disciplines and culture and teaching quality and graduate employability and graduate earnings, more and more highly transparent tools have become available for our international and, of course, our domestic clientele. And so the data, originally intended as a comparative tool, have themselves become drivers of higher education systems and behaviour. And universities, especially in Australia, have become hostage to rankings, the hungry god, as I call it. So am I criticising here or am I welcoming that fact? I guess I'm having a bob each way. I'm also asking, what does the future hold for rankings and data more generally and for their ongoing street cred? And perhaps we should also be asking the question, have we actually reached peak rankings when the sector can realistically bear no more? When the proliferation of rankings and regional rankings and the number of high-profile domestic surveys and ratings blast forth data in such a way and in such a diverse way as to create confusion in equal measure with the transparency and benchmarking that was promised and intended, and indeed so greatly welcomed, should you ask, is this proliferation now diluting your data brand rather than enhancing it? Are we seeing the competitive international rankings marketplace become an arms race of new ranking products rather than an information race for robust, stable and meaningful rankings? We can come back to that one. What I cannot stress too strongly at this point is that all ranking organisations recognise the power that they wield and that that power is used wisely. It was Carly Fiorina, the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, who said the goal is to turn data into information and information into insight. Like all tools, data should form the basis of good decision making. It is in all of our interest to ensure that the insight is right, and when right, it's invaluable. I think now, in June 2017, it's the perfect time to consider all of the above, as the political landscapes that also so intrinsically affect universities alter, and some would say falter, in so many regions. The two, rankings and politics, go hand in hand as always, especially for Australia, as we seek to strengthen the Group of 8 profile as a destination for quality PhD students from India. Yes, we are unashamedly keen to capitalise on the international higher education disruption in India, from the UK's Brexit to the visa decisions of the US Trump administration, and of course the less than politically robust EU. The disruption may have been caused as much by perception as reality, but it does, in particular, open up in India the previously tightly held and strong UK and US quality higher education markets to Australia. And frankly, we've not done as well as we think we could do in that market. So to expand on what I've just said, re the power and responsibility of rankings in such a scenario, context is again called for. The political and economic, not to mention the rankings landscape in which the Group of 8 operates, gives quite an insight into why it's so important everyone associated with data and rankings knows the heavy responsibility they carry. And if I can say to Ben, not Jason, who gave a media comment about rankings on his recent visit to Australia, that rankings mattered to Australian universities probably more than they should, Ben, how I wish that was true. I would fervently love it if they could matter to the Group of 8 less than they actually do. But they matter absolutely, and they must be not only accurate, which we know you do your best to achieve, but provided in sufficient context for a layperson without a background in statistics to be able to use and find that insight. Rankings have no more leeway for error or changed perceptions caused by data collection research than the Group of 8 research quality does. So we're caught in this never-ending cycle. It starts with ensuring our research is world-class, and it certainly is, as I've set out. And this is vital because we know that it's our research data which drives our global ranking positions. Our research has to be excellent, and it is, in any case, a Group of 8 culture to never strive for anything less than excellence. We have no, and I do stress the no, leeway for error here, because we need those rankings to deliver us our international markets. Our rankings are the face of the Group of 8 to the world. As I said before, and speaking very frankly now, we are heavily reliant on those international student markets. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the speech, Australia has a very small population. Our fee-paying international students therefore subsidise our domestic students, they subsidise teaching, and they help pay for more of that world-class research. We are increasingly reliant on those markets, hence our push to expand into India. Our excellence and rankings that reflect that excellence are critical because government funding of what are nominally public universities has dropped to such a low level in Australia. In the late 1980s, 84% of all university funding in Australia came from the federal government. Today, on average, this has dropped to 42%, though this does vary at institutional level. This is so low that Professor Glyn Davis, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, which is currently ranked number 1 in Australia and between 33 and 42, although ANU may contest that, in the world, depending upon which ranking, has commented in a number of speeches that, and I quote here, "The idea of a public university is worth defending. The term suggests commitment to merit-based and equitable entry. A public university means a curriculum that emphasises intellectual inquiry, regardless of the course chosen. It indicates staff, facilities and services to support student learning and campus life. A public university is home to academic freedom in thought, teaching and research, with governance that ensures academic oversight and academic matters. Australian public universities meet those tests. What they are lacking is public funding. A generation ago, Australia's public universities received almost all their income from Canberra. Today, direct Commonwealth recurrent funds cover just 23% of the running costs of the University of Melbourne. So if majority Commonwealth funding is a defining characteristic, there is no public university in Australia." I think that's a fairly sobering quote from the Vice-Chancellor of one of our top institutions. Australian government funding of research is also much lower than in other nations, despite more research being carried out by universities in Australia than in other comparable nations. At the Group of 8 alone, we spend some $6 billion Australian each year on research, and we receive funding of around $2.5 billion, or nearly 2/3 of all government funding directed to research. So you don't have to be a mathematician to work out that there's a fairly significant shortfall there, and that our research has to be subsidised by student fees, or the research simply just wouldn't occur. So indeed, welcome to my world. Hardly optimal, I'm sure you would agree. And here we are, buffeted by those external factors, namely a dysfunctional funding model in Australia and a small population that could never sustain our universities. The Group of 8 continues to deliver excellence against those odds, while at the same time being held hostage to the flurry of rankings and ratings and positioning surveys that now arrive. To repeat, how I fervently wish rankings could matter to us less than they do. Not to denigrate rankings, but there are some months when that flurry makes it seem that the only area of a universities that I haven't seen ranked are its bathroom facilities. And no one jump up and say that's happening, because I'm sure it is happening somewhere in our facilities areas, and I've just simply missed it. Or a journalist hasn't asked me about it. So all that I've said up to now leaves you in no doubt of the importance, in fact the criticality of data and rankings to Australia's Group of 8 universities. And given this criticality, I hope you can see why I've raised the issue of peak rankings, continuity of methodology, and your power and your responsibility to use it wisely and accurately. Your challenge, I know, is to take this high road in an increasingly competitive rankings marketplace, and I would exhort you to do the best you can to do that. Not only in rankings do perceptual and reputational matters run up against the use of data. This is increasingly so in the higher education policy space in Australia. Recently, we've had two examples in Australia where our reputation has been affected by the poor use of data. And in fact, this is becoming an increasing issue for us as it relates to the formation of government higher education policy. In the first example, in 2015, the Group of 8 faced a very unfortunate situation when the Australian Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, which is commonly known as HILDA in Australia, was released. HILDA is intended as a data-driven policy tool. It's actually run out of one of my own universities, out of the University of Melbourne, which made this even trickier. So in 2015, HILDA included data on the Group of 8 that we knew to be absolutely, totally, completely wrong and very damaging to our reputation. In summary, its erroneous conclusion was that there was no degree advantage in graduating from a Geo8 university, as our graduates were only as likely or even less likely to achieve the same level of earnings as those attending non-Geo8 universities. The information was provided to us a few days in advance of its release, and those responsible would not delay the release of the data despite us advising that it was incorrect and us being willing to provide the why and the how. In fact, those responsible for HILDA used our private protest to gain additional media for their data by releasing our letter to the media to illustrate our not accepting their highly critical findings. The team leader responsible for the work was an academic, obviously, and so we found ourselves also being accused of being a group of universities attacking academic freedom. The media lambast was swift and harsh and unrelenting, even from as far as Singapore, Hong Kong, Manila and Mumbai. It was, of course, great media fodder, and for some time, and it still has residual impact, the best universities supposedly offered no graduate, in fact a less graduate income bonus for graduates. But it was wrong. The data errors were only admitted some months later, and of course not publicly, after a Group of 8 universities, so one of my other universities, the University of Queensland, recast the input data used by HILDA and illustrated to the analysts responsible that their outcomes had indeed been compromised significantly. There was no apology, and it was only because the Group of 8 advised some education writers that the error had finally been admitted that you should be able to find, if you search hard enough, a few column centimetres buried somewhere pointing out the HILDA error. The headlines, the social media, the radio, we will never actually be able to fully redress the impact of that. The internet's cache of material means it's there for anyone to see. And this became very obvious soon after HILDA. I travelled to both China and Japan and then actually here to London. And it was clear that the data had been sourced and believed, and its effects have been difficult to counter. So it's the perfect illustration, albeit a domestic one, of the power of publicly released data to the brand health of universities. We are vulnerable and exposed to the blips and the errors, and feel especially so in Australia for all the reasons that I've set out for you this morning. We have to answer almost always publicly to the results of the Excellence in Research for Australia results, international rankings, OECD statistics on research and development performance, and the quantum of our collaboration with industry, and so much more. Those who provide rankings and data surveys to the public do not appear to suffer the same inglorious headlines or damaged brand health if there are errors. The second example of Australian higher education policy running foul of data usage comes from our recent Australian budget, released just last month in May, and the resulting legislation that is currently before the Australian Parliament. In 2016, the Federal Department of Education and Training commissioned consultants Deloitte to work with the sector on an activity-based costing for teaching survey. We participated, albeit reluctantly, but in good faith, aware of the methodological issues with the survey. We warned the government time and again that these issues existed. These included that it was not a like-for-like comparison across institutions. There was a lack of any accounting for research in university costs, plus there was a lack of comparability to a costing exercise conducted in 2010. The report was released the week before the Australian budget, with no broad-based review by the sector, and used against the report's own recommendations to compare costs between 2010 and 2016. So this is not a criticism of Deloitte, it's a criticism of our federal government. Deloitte, within its own report, was very clear the report should not be used in isolation or for policy formulation. However, as governments do, they use the report reputationally to make the case that Australian universities are overfunded for teaching, and to therefore implement a policy of cutting our university funding, which they are now attempting to do through the Federal Parliament. And the sector is united in its opposition to that higher education legislation, and that argument is ongoing. In fact, I think I submitted our submission to the Senate inquiry at about 3 o'clock this morning, so we're fighting the fight. We would say that this is a devious misuse of data as a means to an end by the government. Internationally, we've also seen just how data can be misused. In 2010, we had the case of Mohammed al-Nashki at Alexandria University. For anyone who has forgotten, that university's research impact in the Times Higher was ahead of both Harvard and Stanford, until it was found by other researchers to be the result of Dr. Nashki publishing over 320 of his own articles in a scientific journal of which he was also the editor. So, to return to my theme of data, the good and the bad. Data is always welcome when it is accurate and it's used accurately. Data will always be welcome if it is both accurate and relevant. I cannot stress enough to those of you who create the data how important your role is to the health and well-being of universities and their students around the world. Those factors belong to you. The relevance factor is why I've raised the spectre of peak rankings. Again, only you can ask yourself how best to manage that, but in 2017 I would respectfully say that it does need to be managed. Of course, the Group of 8 takes immense pride in being consistently ranked so highly. We have as much at stake as you in ensuring that those rankings continue to mean something. Our brand health is in your hands, so please treat it as carefully as we do. Thank you very much.